There's a boundary in the oldest records that almost nobody talks about. It's a line in the sand where the story of the world seems to change rules. On one side of that line, rulers reign for tens of thousands of years at a time. Kingship isn't something humans figure out, it descends from heaven. Names read like entries in a ledger, and the numbers are so huge they feel like they belong to another reality. On the other side of that line, everything suddenly looks normal. Kings live and die like ordinary men. Dynasties rise and fall at human speed. Cities match what we've actually excavated. Names show up in other texts, and the record feels like history again. That boundary is marked in the Sumerian King List, preserved on a clay prism that today sits in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. It's carved in cuneiform, those tiny wedge-shaped impressions pressed into wet clay over 4,000 years ago, and it signals the shift with one blunt sentence: then the flood swept over. After that line, you're in recognizable human time. Before it, you're in something else. If you like digging into mysteries hidden in ancient documents, you already know what to do. Hit like, subscribe, and let's get into it. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. The visuals here are just context. The real evidence is in the texts themselves, sitting in museums, waiting for someone to read them without flinching. So tonight, let's do that. Let's read what the oldest records actually say. In 1906, a German-American scholar named Hermann Hilprecht published a translation of a cuneiform source that had been sitting quietly in museum archives. It came from the ruins of Larsa in southern Iraq, and it was part of what scholars now call the Sumerian King List. The most famous copy is the Weld Blundell prism, a small baked clay object about 8 inches tall, covered on all 4 sides with dense writing. And what's striking is the genre. This isn't epic poetry. It's not a hymn. It doesn't read like a myth that wants to entertain you or teach you a moral. It reads like bureaucracy, like record keeping, like an administrative document a royal scribe would maintain to track succession and legitimacy. It starts with a sentence that is almost casual in the way it drops a bomb on your worldview. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. That's the framework. Kingship is not invented. Kingship arrives. It comes down. And then the list begins. Name, city, length of reign. Alulim of Eridu, 28,800 years. Alalgar of Eridu, 36,000 years. Enmenlu Anna of Bad Tibira, 43,200 years. And it just keeps going like that, 8 kings across 5 cities. No commentary. No, and here's why. No attempt to persuade you. Just names and numbers, recorded with the same straight-faced precision you'd use for grain inventories and land surveys. The total gets carefully tallied. 241,200 years. And then, with zero ceremony, the text says, then the flood swept over. That's the line. That's the hinge. And here's the part that makes this almost impossible to dismiss. The king list doesn't end there. It continues. New kings, new cities, new dynasties. But now the numbers begin to collapse. Post-flood rulers reign for 600 years. Then 400, then 200, then 100, and then, faster and faster, the reigns shrink into lengths that historians would call credible, not normal, right away more like a world slowly cooling down, as if whatever made the earlier ages possible is fading, generation by generation, until we reach the lifespan range that looks like human history. And then the list drops a name that snaps everything into focus. Gilgamesh. Yes, that Gilgamesh king of Uruk, recorded here with a reign of 126 years. The same Gilgamesh, whose epic is one of the oldest surviving works of literature. The same Gilgamesh whose city walls archaeologists have excavated. The same Gilgamesh referenced in other ancient sources, which means we're not dealing with a document that's myth on one page and history on the next. We're dealing with a single, continuous record, written in the same tone, using the same format, by scribes who never pause to tell you, okay, now we're switching genres. The text doesn't divide itself into legend and fact. It presents one timeline, interrupted by one event, the flood. And that creates a problem that mainstream archaeology and mainstream history tend to solve by splitting the document in half. They accept the post-flood section because parts of it can be cross-checked. Some names line up with other king lists. Some dynasties fit known archaeological layers. The cities are real. The world is recognizable. But they reject the pre-flood section as fantasy because the reign lengths are impossible. Here's the issue. The king list itself makes no such distinction. It doesn't flag the first section as symbolic. It doesn't label the early kings as gods. It doesn't say, these are metaphors for eras. It just lists them calmly, administratively, as if this is exactly what a scribe is supposed to preserve. So if we trust the document when it says Gilgamesh, why do we suddenly stop trusting it when it says Alulim? If the same scribal tradition preserved both halves in the same form, what exactly are we doing when we accept one and dismiss the other? At minimum, we're imposing a modern filter that the text itself doesn't provide. And once you notice that, the long reigns start to look less like random exaggeration and more like something structured, something deliberate. Because the numbers aren't messy, they're clean, they're patterned, they read like calculations, not campfire storytelling. So the question becomes, what were the scribes recording? What did they think they were preserving? And why does the king list place a single catastrophe, the flood, as the boundary between an age of impossible rule and the world we recognize as human? Because if that boundary is doing real work in the text, it's not just marking a disaster, it's marking a change in what it meant to be king. Now, let's slow down and actually look at those pre-flood numbers, because once you do, the whole thing gets weirder in a way that's harder to hand-wave away. Those reign lengths aren't just really big. They're precise, they're structured, they're built on a mathematical logic the Sumerians used everywhere else. The Sumerians counted in a sexagesimal system base 60. It's the same system that survives right now in your life, every single day. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. That's not a coincidence, that's inheritance. And in that system, the largest major unit of time in their tradition was a sa, equal to 3,600 years. So take the first king again, Alulim, 28,800 years, that's 8 rial. Alalga, 36,000 years, that's 10 rial. Enmen Luana, 43,200 years, that's 12 rial. Every single pre-flood reign is a clean multiple of 3,600. That detail matters, because it changes what we're looking at. These aren't the kind of numbers you get when someone is just trying to impress an audience with legendary long lives. Storytellers don't usually build their exaggeration on consistent, standardized units. They go uneven, they go poetic, they go dramatic. This is calculated. This is the kind of regularity you'd expect from a culture that invented written accounting systems and built mathematical frameworks powerful enough to track astronomical cycles. These people weren't guessing their way through numbers. They were obsessed with order, measurement, and recording. So when a scribe writes reign lengths as exact SAR multiples, it suggests something. The scribe thinks the pattern is real enough to be preserved accurately, which leaves you with two possibilities, and neither one is comfortable. Possibility 1. The reign lengths aren't literal lifespans, but symbolic representations, eras, dynasties, or cosmic cycles compressed into the reigns of named rulers. That's an idea scholars often reach for, because it lets you say, okay, the numbers are symbolic, so we don't need to treat them as biological reality. Indifferent and different. But if that's true, then another question immediately lands. Why attach those cycles to specific kings with personal names and cities? Why present it in the format of human succession at all? If the Sumerians wanted to list cosmic ages, they could have done that. They had mythic literature and theological texts where cosmic cycles were normal. But this isn't written like a myth. It's written like administration, and it lists kings the same way it lists later, verifiable human rulers. So if it's symbolic in a way the text refuses to clarify. Possibility 2 is the unsettling one. The opening framework isn't once upon a time. It's after the kingship descended from heaven. For the Sumerians, rulership wasn't something humans invented. It wasn't a slow social evolution. It wasn't we formed tribes, then chiefs, then kings. In their own record, kingship is an institution delivered to earth, and the King List doesn't just say kingship existed. It tells you something about its movement, like a physical or metaphysical object travelling from place to place. Kingship is in Eridu, then it moves to another city, then another, like a transfer of a thing, and then the flood happens. Here's a question people don't ask enough. After the flood, where does kingship go? Because the text says it continues city to city, dynasty to dynasty, but it never again says it descended from heaven. That phrase doesn't return. The gods don't vanish from Mesopotamian religion after the flood. The temples remain, rituals continue, offerings continue, prayers continue, but something changes in the way rulership itself is described. Before the flood, kingship descends. After the flood, kingship transfers. And post-flood, kings start needing justification. That shift matters because it lines up with a pattern we're going to see across multiple traditions. An early age of direct divine involvement, followed by a boundary, followed by human autonomy. Not because humans suddenly became more advanced, but because something that once governed directly is no longer governing directly. Now, before we zoom out to Egypt and Genesis and all the rest, there's an important detail sitting in plain sight. Later Babylonians were also disturbed by these ancient records. And that's a big deal, because it means the confusion isn't just modern. In the British Museum, there's a fragment most visitors walk right past without noticing. It's catalogue number K11261, a broken clay tablet in cuneiform. It's part of what scholars call the dynastic chronicle, dating to around 500 BC. This isn't a Sumerian original. It's a later Babylonian scholarly copy tradition, scribes copying older king lists, comparing versions, noting discrepancies, trying to reconcile contradictions. In other words, even ancient Mesopotamian scholars were looking at the earliest records and going, wait, how do we make sense of this? And what troubled them wasn't the existence of pre-flood kings. That part they accepted. They weren't like, oh, obviously those are fake. What bothered them was inconsistency. Some copies listed 8 antediluvian rulers, others listed 10. Reign lengths varied between versions. The numbers didn't always line up perfectly, but every single version agreed on one point. There is a break, there is a before and an after, and the flood marks it. Modern scholarship often treats that break as a mythic convenience, like ancient writers inserting a flood story to separate legendary time from historical time. It was in Flife, but that explanation assumes something. It It assumes ancient scribes couldn't distinguish between myth and record keeping. And the evidence doesn't support that assumption, because when you compare the Sumerian King List to later Babylonian copies, you notice something that feels backwards if this is all invented mythology. The pre-flood section is strangely stable across centuries of copying. The names remain consistent. Alulim is always first. Eridu is always the first city. The structure holds. The post-flood section, by contrast, shows the kind of variations you'd expect from real history being edited and transmitted over time. Dynasties emphasizing their own regions, political rewrites, local biases, shifts in legitimacy claims. That's the opposite of what you'd expect if the pre-flood section were just a story. Myths tend to evolve. Details shift. Names morph. Numbers drift. The tale adapts to different audiences. But a carefully preserved record, something treated as foundational, stays rigid. And that's exactly how the pre-flood section behaves, which leads to a very uncomfortable possibility. The pre-flood portion may not have been created as a myth at all. It may have been preserved as something the scribes believed was real, whether literally, symbolically, or as memory of something older than them. Now, there's another detail in the language that opens a door most people don't notice. The term used for kingship is Nam Lugal, not just rulership or government in an abstract sense, but the specific institution of sacred kingship, legitimate authority derived from divine sanction. That term shows up across Mesopotamian texts with consistent meaning. It's what separates a king from a warlord, a dynasty from a takeover. It's divine legitimacy as a formal institution. And the King List says, after the flood, Namlugal was brought down again to Kish, not established, not invented, not created, brought down again. That implies restoration of something that existed before, something that was lost or disrupted. But here's the twist. The text never says the pre-flood kings ruled by the same mechanism. It doesn't bother justifying them at all. They're simply listed, as if their authority was self-evident. After the flood, kings need divine backing. Before the flood, kingship seems like it just is. And once you see that, you start to notice a second shift subtler, but everywhere once you're looking for it. Pre-flood rulers are described with what linguists call passive authority. They don't conquer, they don't campaign, they don't build walls, they don't justify themselves through action, they simply are kings. The land is under them without explanation. Post-flood rulers, even legendary ones like Gilgamesh, are defined by what they do, building walls, fighting enemies, seeking immortality, performing kingship, rather than simply embodying it. And that distinction, being versus performing, is going to become a major thread, because it shows up again in Egypt, in biblical tradition, and in the way early cities appear in archaeology. Because now we have to ask something that shifts the entire conversation. If the oldest record we have doesn't describe the birth of civilization, but a transition, what exactly changed at that boundary? And more importantly, who or what was no longer there afterward? To understand why that boundary matters, we have to look at what the King List says around it. Not just the numbers, but the cities, the language, and the strange way early civilization seems to appear in the ground. Because the Sumerian King List names 5 antediluvian cities: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shurupak. And here's what's important. Archaeology confirms these are among the oldest settlements in Mesopotamia. These aren't fictional places, they're real sites, with real occupational layers, real temple foundations, real evidence of early urban life. But there's something strange about how these first cities are treated in the texts, something that becomes obvious once you compare them to later cities like Kish, Uruk, Ur, and Lagash. Later cities get founding stories. Texts will tell you who built the first wall, who laid out the temple precinct, who dedicated the first brick, who performed the rituals, which God approved the construction, what omens appeared, how the king proclaimed legitimacy. Even when the stories are wrapped in myth, they're full of human action. But the 5 antediluvian cities don't get that treatment. They just exist. Eridu is the first city in the list. It's presented as already functioning when the record begins. And its main temple, the Abzu, dedicated to Enki, shows up in texts as if it has always been there. No, we built it. No, we founded it. No dramatic moment where the first brick is laid. It's treated like geography, like a river, like a mountain, like something that's simply part of the world from the beginning. And that difference is subtle, but it's massive. Because once you see it, you start to notice the same pattern elsewhere. The oldest institutions aren't described as invented, but as inherited. And archaeology throws fuel on that fire. When archaeologists excavate early Mesopotamian settlements, what they often expect is a slow learning curve. Villages gradually expanding into towns, towns slowly organizing into cities, urban planning emerging step by step as people figure things out. But that's not what we see in some of the earliest layers. Take Eridu, again the city the King List places first, the place where kingship descends from heaven. Early layers at Eridu show an organized settlement already structured around a central temple complex, with clear separation between sacred space, administration, and residential areas. Not a messy village that slowly becomes a city that looks like it already knows what it's doing. The same pattern shows up at other early sites. The first levels aren't primitive experiments. They're smaller, yes, but not clumsy, not confused. They show deliberate planning. And standard archaeology has explanations for this. The usual argument is diffusion. Maybe urbanism developed elsewhere first, and Mesopotamia adopted it. But that creates its own problem, because there's no clear elsewhere in the archaeological record that looks like the missing prototype. There isn't an earlier chain of cities that clearly demonstrates the step-by-step invention of urban planning that then spreads into Sumer. Instead, Mesopotamian urban planning appears, functions efficiently for centuries, and then, like the King List, it seems to shift after a boundary that ancient sources call the flood. After that point, cities grow more organically. They expand unevenly. They show the trial and error feel of human development, haphazard additions, irregular street patterns, chaotic expansion. Before it, they feel complete. And this is where the King List starts to sound less like the origin story of civilization and more like a document describing the moment civilization had to be maintained by humans alone. The King List doesn't say Eridu was founded. It says kingship descended to Eridu. That's an entirely different story. Not we built it. Either more like it was given. Now, if that sounds extreme, stay with me, because the texts themselves push in that direction, especially when we look at the concept of divine rulership after the flood. There's a Babylonian chronicle in the Louvre tablet AO1986-4 dating to around 1700 BC that lists rulers of Isin, a city that rose after collapsed. It follows a standard list format: names, reign lengths, major events, but the opening line is strange. It refers to the first ruler, Ishbi-Era, with the divine determinative, the cuneiform marker used to indicate divinity. In other words, it calls him divine, and that's bizarre, because Ishbi-Era lived around 2000 BC, well within what we consider the historical period. His dynasty lasted barely a century. We have mundane administrative records about him: grain distribution, border disputes, normal government business. By all evidence, he was human, so Why is he labelled divine? Because the text is capturing something about how rulership was conceptualized in the early post-flood world. There's a transitional era where kings are not gods, but still desperate to claim closeness to what kingship used to be. And after that early phase, the language shifts. Later kings are never called divine in that direct way again. They can be mighty king, beloved of the gods, appointed by Enlil, but not gods themselves. Something changes between the first ruler and his successors. Not necessarily in biology though, we'll come back to that, but in legitimacy. And the language gives us one of the clearest clues. Sumerian contains different constructions for describing divine status. When very early texts describe pre-flood or immediate post-flood rulers, they use Nam-Dingir-Ra, divine nature, a state of being, like Nam-Lugal for kingship, not a title, not a claim, an inherent quality. But later, when kings try to claim divinity, the grammar shifts. You start seeing comparative or possessive constructions as a god, my god, like a god. The divinity becomes metaphorical, aspirational, claimed rather than simply present, and that pattern shows up across Mesopotamian texts around the same broad boundary. It's like divine kingship goes from reality to memory to branding. The third dynasty of Ur, around 2100 BC, is often seen as the last serious attempt to revive divine kingship in Sumer. Kings like Ur-Nammu and Shulgi built massive temple complexes, commissioned hymns praising their divinity, and reshaped administration around their godlike role. But it doesn't last. 3 generations, and the whole experiment collapses. After that, Mesopotamian rulers stop claiming direct divinity in a meaningful way. Kings remain chosen by gods, granted authority by gods, favoured by gods, but always mediated, never direct. And that gradual shift divine nature to divine approval is exactly what you'd expect if the original source of kingship had withdrawn. Now, there's an even more curious detail buried in early royal titles, something that appears briefly and then disappears. Some early post-flood rulers, especially in fragmentary texts linked to Kish, use titles implying control over the me, the divine powers, the cosmic ordinances, the fundamental principles that govern reality. In Mesopotamian thought, the me aren't human laws. They're reality's operating system: kingship, priesthood, truth, falsehood, craftsmanship, agriculture forces that exist independently of human invention. And early rulers sometimes present themselves as administrators of those cosmic principles, as if they have direct authority over the system itself. Later kings never do that. Later kings claim to rule within the order of the me, not over it. That difference is enormous. One group positions itself like it's plugged into the control panel. The next group positions itself like it's learning to operate within the rules. Which brings us back to the question that keeps haunting this boundary. If the gods didn't die and the temples remained, and rituals continued, why did governance change so drastically? Because the religious infrastructure doesn't collapse after the flood boundary. In fact, it becomes more elaborate. The priesthood becomes more specialized. The rituals become more complex. The sacred calendar becomes more structured. The gods stay central to culture for thousands of years, but the gods stop governing. Early texts describe gods making direct administrative decisions, where cities should be built, who should rule, when wars should happen. Not prayers asking for guidance, actual decisions, like management. The Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest Sumerian creation texts, describes divine figures walking among cities, reorganizing settlements, making immediate choices. The tone is physical, present, direct. After the boundary, divine communication becomes mediated omens, dreams, priestly interpretation, rituals designed to coax meaning out of silence. And that shift from direct dialogue to indirect divination isn't a minor theological evolution. It's a structural change in how reality is experienced. And the strangest part is this: later religious tradition insists nothing changed. Priests in 500 BC perform rituals they claim go back to antediluvian times. Temple liturgies preserve archaic Sumerian phrases that later priests don't fully understand, but recite anyway carefully, faithfully, as if the words themselves are a key. The forms continue, but the presence described in the earliest texts, the unmediated, physically manifest authority, is gone. Kings now need coronation rituals, priestly validation, omen readings, public theological justification. None of that appears in descriptions of antediluvian kingship. And that makes sense if early kingship didn't require justification because there was no human audience to persuade. It descended from heaven, and that was that. Afterward, kingship exists in the absence of its original source. So here's the question that starts to form, and it's not a small one. If the gods didn't die, and they didn't rule anymore, where did they go? And why did every culture that inherited their empty temples spend thousands of years trying to call them back? And this is where it gets even harder to shrug off as just Sumerian mythology, because Mesopotamia isn't alone. If the King List were the only ancient record doing this extreme longevity, a catastrophic boundary, then human-scale history, we could file it away as cultural imagination. But multiple civilizations, separated by geography, language, and tradition, preserve the same basic structure: a before, a boundary, an after, and the lifespans collapse right at the boundary. Let's start with Egypt. In Turin, in the Museo Egizio, there's a document known as the Turin Royal Canon. It's one of the most important king lists from ancient Egypt, compiled during the reign of Ramesses II, around 1250 BC. It was originally a long papyrus scroll listing rulers from the earliest times up through the dynasties. Most of it is damaged. The papyrus is fragmented, torn, missing pieces. But one portion survives in a way that matters: the transition zone. This is the part that doesn't fit neatly into the modern timeline. The canon lists not only human pharaohs, but pre-dynastic rulers' figures associated with the divine. It includes the Shemsu-Hor, the followers of Horus, described as semi-divine dynasties ruling Egypt before the first dynasty, and their combined reign is given in the thousands of years, 13,420 years across those early lines. Then the papyrus breaks. There's a gap right where you'd want the most clarity. And when it resumes, we're back in the world historians recognize. Human pharaohs, like Menes, often linked with Nama, whose reign is given as 62 years. So you go from an age of millennia to an age of decades. And the text doesn't explain it. It doesn't argue for it. It doesn't justify it. It simply records it as consecutive reality. Now, here's what makes that especially interesting. Egyptian priests, in later periods, the Greco-Roman era, centuries after the pyramids, preserved the same framework. A priest historian named Manetho, writing around 280 BC, describes long divine or semi-divine dynasties before the human ones. He maintains the same structure: an age of gods, then an age of humans. If this were just myth-making, you'd expect it to grow more exaggerated over time. You'd expect later priests to embellish the past. But what you see instead is preservation, a stubborn refusal to let go of the idea that Egypt's history begins with something other than human kingship. It's the same kind of problem we saw in Mesopotamia. Later scribes don't treat the divine dynasties as fairy tales. They treat them as chronology. Now, let's shift to the text people usually think is purely religious, but contains a pattern that's almost too systematic to be storytelling. Genesis. The book of Genesis contains a lifespan curve that is strange. Not because its long religious literature can have long lifespans. That's not shocking. What's shocking is how structured the decline is. Before the flood, the patriarchs lived for centuries, pushing close to 1,000 years. Adam, 930 years. Seth, 912 years. Methuselah, 969 years. Then the flood happens, and immediately after, lifespans are still long, but they start dropping in a way that feels like a biological decay curve, generation by generation. Shem, 600 years. Arphaxad, 438 years. Then another generation, 433 years. By Abraham, 10 generations after the flood, you're down to 175 years. By Moses, 120 is exceptional. By the era of Psalm 90, a normal lifespan is described as 70 years, or 80 if you're strong. That's basically modern human longevity. Here's what matters. The decline isn't random. It's not poetic. It doesn't stay consistently legendary. It collapses steadily, like something is being lost over time. If Genesis were purely symbolic myth, why write it like this? Why not keep everyone extraordinary, or keep everyone normal? Why preserve a gradual, generational collapse? Because a decline curve suggests a memory. The world changed, and whatever made extreme longevity possible faded out over time. And now put the three traditions side by side. Sumer, antediluvian kings reign for Sar multiples, then the flood, then reigns measured in centuries collapsing toward decades. Egypt, divine dynasties rule for thousands of years, then a break, then human pharaohs with normal reign lengths. Genesis, patriarchs live nearly 1,000 years, then the flood, then a generational decline down to modern ranges. These texts weren't written together. They weren't coordinated. Sumerian sources predate Genesis by over 1,000 years. Egyptian dynastic tradition developed independently in a completely different cultural and linguistic world. Yet the structure repeats. Extreme longevity before a catastrophic boundary, followed by rapid normalization. At some point, coincidence stops being the easy answer. Now, a common scholarly move is to say the big numbers are symbolic. And yes, in Sumer, you can point to the sexagesimal structure and argue that Sar multiples represent cosmic cycles. That's a real argument, and it's not nonsense, but it runs into an immediate problem. The symbolism stops right at the flood. The post-flood section is messy and irregular. 90 years here, 30 years there, 7 years somewhere else. That's what real history looks like. If the pre-flood numbers are symbolic, why do the scribes abandon symbolism exactly at the same boundary other cultures mark as a turning point? If you were doing cosmic math as allegory, you could keep doing it. You could keep reigns neat and structured forever, but they don't. Order collapses into irregularity, and the same thing shows up in Genesis. Pre-flood ages have patterns that scholars note multiples, structures, numerological echoes. Post-flood ages get irregular and messy. Again, if it's symbolism, why does it degrade? Symbols don't have to decay, but inheritance does. Loss does. A system running out does. And that leads to a reading that's uncomfortable, but hard to ignore. These traditions aren't describing the rise of civilization. They're describing the end of something. Egypt has a concept sometimes translated as Zep Tepi, the first time. Modern pop versions often frame it as creation, a golden beginning. But in many later Egyptian texts, it's not described as a start. It's described like an era that's gone. The time when gods ruled directly is over. Human time follows. And in Mesopotamia, the language reflects the same shift. Early texts describe direct divine action. Later texts describe ritual, mediation, interpretation. So here's what starts forming when you take the pattern seriously. These cultures remembered a withdrawal, not necessarily in one dramatic moment, but as a boundary event that separates two modes of reality. Before, divine authority is direct, kingship descends, longevity is extreme, cities appear already organized, knowledge seems complete. After, kingship transfers through humans, lifespans normalize, divine communication becomes indirect, and civilization becomes something people maintain instead of receive. And that's why the flood matters, not because it's a flood myth, because it functions as a closure point. It's the line where the records say, whatever that world was, it ended. And now we live in what came after. But if that's even partially true, literal or metaphorical, we run into a question that modern history doesn't love. What kind of world produces rulers who reign for millennia, then loses that capacity? And if that capacity disappears, why do multiple traditions remember it not as fantasy, but as an earlier era with different rules? Because the more you stare at the boundary, the more it starts to feel like this isn't a story about beginnings. It's a story about something being taken away. Which brings us to another piece of the puzzle, something you can see not just in king lists and genealogies, but in the sudden appearance of sophisticated knowledge itself. Because the next question is simple, and it's devastating. If early civilization wasn't gradually invented, why does it show up already working? If you step away from the king lists for a moment and just look at the material record writing, math, architecture, law, you run into a different version of the same problem. The standard story we're taught is a smooth climb. Humans start simple, then gradually get more complex. Marks become pictographs, pictographs become writing, villages become towns, towns become cities, basic trade becomes administration, and eventually you get civilization. It's a nice story because it feels intuitive. It matches how we imagine progress, but the earliest evidence from Mesopotamia doesn't really behave that way. It behaves like something showing up already functional. In 1929, archaeologists working at Uruk uncovered a small limestone tablet about the size of a modern smartphone. It's one of the oldest examples of writing ever found, dating to around 3400 BC. And what shocked researchers wasn't just the age, it was the maturity. This wasn't a childlike first attempt at writing. It wasn't crude drawings of animals and stick figures. It was accounting. It was an administrative record. Grain storage, worker rations, temple distributions. It used a developed numerical notation system, standardized signs for categories of goods, multiplicative relationships, complex record keeping. In other words, it wasn't writing as art, it was writing as infrastructure. And that matters, because you'd expect early writing to begin with simple labels, names, ownership marks, basic pictorial shorthand. Then, over centuries, it would become capable of complex administration. But in Mesopotamia, the earliest writing we find is already doing complicated bureaucracy, and then it evolves fast. Within a surprisingly short span, basically within a handful of generations, you go from this already sophisticated accounting system to full cuneiform, capable of recording abstract ideas, legal codes, contracts, literature, and myth. That speed isn't just impressive. According to most models of how scripts develop, it's abnormal. It's as if someone built the engine before the bicycle. Now stack that on top of their mathematics. The Sumerians used the sexagesimal system base 60, and it's easy to say, oh, they just counted that way. But base 60 isn't a natural default the way base 10 is. Base 10 makes sense because we have 10 fingers. Base 20 shows up because humans have 20 digits, including toes. Base 5 makes sense for one hand. Those systems emerge naturally. Base 60 requires abstraction. It's a deliberately powerful base because 60 is divisible by so many numbers. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30. That makes it extremely efficient for fractions, trade, measurement, astronomy, geometry. It's not just a counting habit, it's a computational tool. It's the kind of system you'd design if you already understood complex calculation and wanted maximum flexibility. And here's the part that's hard to explain with a slow evolution narrative. The earliest mathematical tablets assume base 60 as foundational. No simpler system precedes it in the record. No proto-phase, where they're experimenting with different bases and stumbling into 60. They start there, and that system becomes so durable that it outlives the civilization that used it. It passes to Babylon, into later astronomy, into Greek science, into modern measurement of time and angles. A Bronze Age culture in southern Iraq introduced a mathematical framework so efficient that 5,000 years later, we still haven't replaced it. Now, let's move from numbers to stone and mud brick. In 1954, excavations at Eridu reached the deepest occupation layers. Archaeologists expected huts, makeshift structures, early trial and error building, the kind of primitive experimentation you'd assume at the start of settled life. Instead, they found a temple, not a rough shrine. A planned religious complex aligned, leveled, right-angled, deliberately designed. And it wasn't even the first temple. Under it were earlier temples, layered one on top of another, each showing competence. The earliest levels were smaller, yes, but not clumsy, not confused. The basic architectural principles were already in place. Again, no learning curve. And this no learning curve problem isn't confined to Mesopotamia. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dating to around 9,500 BC, features massive stone pillars arranged in circles, carved with sophisticated animal reliefs. It's monumental architecture built by people who, according to older models, should have still been simple hunter-gatherers. And there are no practice runs beneath it, no crude prototypes. It appears already masterful. Standard archaeology often responds with some version of, well, they must have had skilled builders and we just haven't found the earlier stages. Okay, but that's the point. We keep having to invent missing stages to preserve the gradual evolution story. The physical record keeps giving us fully formed moments where you'd expect messy experimentation. Now add law. The code of Ur-Nammu, dating to around 2100 BC, is the oldest surviving law code we have. And what's remarkable isn't just that it exists. Early societies obviously had rules. It's the sophistication of the reasoning. The code distinguishes between intentional and accidental harm. It sets proportional punishment based on injury severity. It recognizes different legal statuses. It implies a system of courts and procedures. This is legal philosophy, not tribal custom, and the text itself hints that the system is already old. It references established judgments and earlier decisions suggesting Ur-Nammu wasn't inventing law, but formalizing something inherited. Yet, where are the centuries of legal evolution we'd expect to see leading up to that? The same issue appears in mathematics. Some of the earliest Mesopotamian mathematical tablets solve problems that look like algebra. They calculate square roots. They handle geometric relationships that anticipate what later becomes the Pythagorean theorem long before Pythagoras. And Babylonian astronomy, especially by the first millennium BC, develops mathematical models that predict planetary movements with startling accuracy. Some methods resemble iterative approximation techniques that won't be common in Europe until much later. But here's the detail that makes it feel like we're staring at a ghost. Those Babylonian texts often describe their knowledge as inherited. They refer to old tablets, ancient observations, long records maintained over generations. They cite eclipse cycles and planetary patterns spanning spans of time far beyond the lifetime of any single astronomer or dynasty. They claim to be analyzing data from deep time, and some of those traditions explicitly say the knowledge comes from before the flood. Modern scholars typically treat that phrase as mythic framing, like saying, "in the beginning," as a rhetorical flourish. But if the math is too advanced to have appeared from nowhere, and the texts insist it was inherited from older sources, we have to ask, inherited from where? Because what makes the whole situation even stranger is the overall pattern of development after the early burst. If civilization was invented from scratch around 3500 BC, you'd expect accelerating innovation each generation building rapidly on the last. Instead, what we often see is early completion, followed by slow refinement. Writing appears already functional for complex administration and then stabilizes. Cuneiform doesn't fundamentally change for 2000 years. Math appears powerful and then plateaus. Later cultures use it, but don't radically advance it for millennia. Architecture appears competent early. Later structures get bigger and more decorated, but the core engineering principles remain stable. That pattern, early completeness followed by slow change, doesn't feel like invention. It feels like inheritance, like receiving a system, maintaining it, gradually losing some of its original clarity, and then rebuilding forward at a normal human pace once the given part runs out. Which brings us back to the question we were circling through the King List. If early civilization looks like it arrives already working, and the oldest records describe kingship descending from heaven, and multiple traditions place a catastrophic boundary between an earlier age and our human one, then maybe we're not looking at the birth of civilization. Maybe we're looking at the moment humans became custodians of something that already existed. And if that's the case, then the flood boundary isn't just a story about water. It's the line where the instruction manual stops being updated. It's the moment when whatever maintained the system, whether gods, an older human culture, or something we don't have a category for anymore, withdraws. Which leads to the next piece of evidence, and it's one of the most telling shifts in the entire ancient record. After that boundary, divine communication changes form, not because people stop believing, but because they start trying to interpret silence. If you want to see the withdrawal idea play out in a way that's almost impossible to miss, don't start with kings. Start with religion, because the religious infrastructure doesn't disappear after the flood boundary. It becomes more organized, more professional, more complex, and that's the key. You don't build increasingly elaborate systems for something that was never there. You build them when something used to be direct and becomes difficult. In the Yale Babylonian collection, there's a tablet known as YBC 4644, dating to around 1800 BC. It's a liver omen manual, an exispacy text, essentially a divination guidebook. It tells priests how to interpret the shape, color, and markings on a sacrificed sheep's liver to determine what the gods want. And it's detailed, not vague, not follow your intuition. It catalogues dozens of possible configurations and assigns meanings to them. A split in the gallbladder means military defeat. A darkened left lobe suggests illness for the king. A certain vein pattern predicts harvest failure. This isn't casual superstition. It's professionalized interpretation, codified, standardized, teachable, a whole technical system. And the historical significance isn't whether liver divination works, it's what it represents. By 1800 BC, Mesopotamian priests needed elaborate interpretive tools to understand divine will, because the gods weren't giving clear instructions anymore. Now, compare that to the oldest religious texts. In early Sumerian literature, like the Eridu Genesis, divine communication is direct. Gods speak like administrators. They issue commands. They give instructions without mediation. When Enki decides to save humanity from the flood, the text basically goes, Enki opened his mouth and addressed Ziusudra. Tear down your house, build a boat. Direct speech, clear instruction, no omen reading, no symbolic decoding. Now jump forward 1,000 years. In later Mesopotamian texts, especially by the first millennium BC, the gods rarely speak directly to humans in that same unfiltered way. Communication becomes dream-based, omen-based, divination-based. A god might send a troubling vision. Priests interpret it. A king receives a sign. Scholars debate it. Entire institutions form around the act of decoding. And here's the thing, that's not what you'd build if the gods were always silent. If divine communication was always indirect, you'd start with divination as the default. You wouldn't move from direct dialogue to elaborate omen science. Evolution in religious practice usually moves toward abstraction, yes, but this feels like something else. It feels like replacement, like a clear signal degrading into noise, forcing humans to develop filters, and the evidence for that shift isn't only in texts, it's in architecture. Early temples in Mesopotamia are structurally different from later ones in a way people don't talk about enough. The earliest temples at Eridu, dating back into the 6th millennium BC, have central chambers with raised platforms that scholars interpret as god seats, but they don't have much space designed for large human crowds. They're not built like public assembly halls. The architecture implies the temple is primarily the residence of the deity, not a stage for human worship, a place the god occupies. Now watch what happens as time moves forward. By the 3rd millennium BC, temple layouts become increasingly focused on priestly activity. Storage rooms multiply, areas for ritual implements expand, processional spaces become more important. There's more architecture devoted to ceremony, performance, and mediation. And then you get the ziggurat, those iconic stepped temple towers that become common later. Ziggurats aren't designed like homes. They're designed like machines. They have processional pathways, elevated platforms, staged access points, spaces built for controlled ritual movement, symbolic ascent, public ceremony. A ziggurat doesn't feel like a god who walks into a chamber and speaks. It feels like humans trying to invoke a presence that doesn't show up automatically. The structure itself becomes an instrument of calling. Now look at the priesthood. In the earliest city-states, the high priest or priestess, the En, isn't just an interpreter of divine will. Some texts describe the En as someone who dwells with the god, implying an attendant role, a companion role, someone present with presence. But as time moves forward, the priesthood fragments into specialists, Baru priests for exispacy, Arshipu priests for purification and omen interpretation, Mashmashu ritual specialists, dream interpreters, astrologer priests. By the time you reach the Assyrian Empire, royal courts employ full-time diviners who file written omen reports about everything: bird flights, lunar eclipses, oil patterns on water, malformed births, strange clouds, anomalies in the sky. Nineveh's archives contain thousands of these reports. Think about that for a second. That's a civilization devoting enormous resources to interpreting signs because the direct line is gone. And it gets even more obvious in how later texts speak. Early sources describe offerings and then state what happened. The god accepted, the god rejected, the god spoke, the god acted. Later sources introduce conditional language. If the god accepts this offering, should the goddess be pleased? May the god hear. That uncertainty is the key. The religious system evolves to address uncertainty because something that once responded clearly is now distant. And what makes it historically eerie is that later religion often refuses to admit the change. Babylonian priests in 500 BC claim they are performing rituals identical to those performed thousands of years earlier. They preserve liturgies in archaic Sumerian words they no longer fully understand, but repeat faithfully anyway, because they believe correctness might restore connection. They maintain the forms even when the original function has changed. And this produces a paradox at the heart of post-flood religion. You have increasingly elaborate systems designed to communicate with beings who no longer communicate clearly. You have specialists dedicated to decoding messages that arrive as riddles. You have rituals designed not just to honor the gods, but to pull them back into presence, which raises the question that keeps growing larger the deeper you go. If the gods didn't die, and the temples remained sacred, and their names were still invoked, what exactly happened that turned conversation into divination? Now, this is where the flood narratives themselves start to matter in a new way. Because when you read the flood stories closely, especially the Mesopotamian versions, they don't end with the gods returning to rule. They end with the gods pulling away. In the British Museum, Tablet K, 3375, preserves part of the Epic of Gilgamesh Tablet Xine, where Utnapishtim describes the flood. Most people focus on the similarities to Noah, but there's a detail that changes the emotional tone of the entire story. After the waters recede, Utnapishtim offers a sacrifice, and the gods gather around it like flies. Not like majestic, composed rulers, like starving beings desperate for offerings. Then Enlil is furious that humanity survived, and another god, Ea, has to argue against Enlil's wrath. This isn't the vibe of omnipotent beings calmly executing a moral plan. It reads more like a catastrophic event spiraling out of control, with gods reacting. And then comes the strangest line of all. Enlil approaches Utnapishtim and his wife, touches their foreheads, and says, essentially, formerly Utnapishtim was a human being, but now he and his wife shall be like us gods. Then he sends them away, far away to the mouth of the rivers, beyond human reach. Let that sink in. The flood story ends with the last human granted divine status being exiled to a remote boundary where humans cannot access him. In other words, the one living bridge to the old world is deliberately removed, and the gods do not return to govern, they retreat. That pattern repeats across flood traditions in different cultures. Survivors aren't preserved so the gods can rule again. Survivors are preserved so humanity can continue without direct divine governance. And if the flood marks withdrawal, then the question becomes unavoidable. What exactly was being withdrawn? Authority, presence, biology, knowledge, or all of it at once? Because the next piece of evidence, maybe the most human, the most emotionally sharp, comes from a figure who sits right on the edge of this transition. Gilgamesh, a king, real enough to have a city wall you can touch, and a story built around one idea. He isn't searching for immortality because he fears death. He's searching for it because he knows it once existed. Here's where this stops feeling like abstract theory and turns into something personal, because the transition isn't just recorded in numbers or priestly systems. It's dramatized in a story whose central character is almost certainly historical, Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh isn't just ancient literature. It's a memory wrapped in narrative. And the reason it hits so hard is because it's not really about a man discovering mortality. It's about a man discovering that the old world is closed. In 1853, Hormuz Rassam, working under Austin Henry Layard, excavated clay tablets from the ruins of Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh. Those tablets, translated later, gave us the most complete version of the Epic of Gilgamesh ever recovered. And buried in Tablet XI, the Flood Tablet, is more than a flood story. It's the boundary itself, the moment when the rules change. But the epic's emotional engine is earlier than that. Gilgamesh doesn't go searching for immortality, because death is a concept he suddenly realizes exists. He searches because he believes immortality should be possible. He believes it used to be real. And that belief makes sense when you place him in the context of the King List. The Sumerian King List records Gilgamesh as an early king of Uruk, reigning 126 years. That's long, but not absurd in the antediluvian way. It's like a world still cooling down, still carrying residue of something older. And then there's the detail that pushes him right into the in-between category, his parentage. Later traditions, and even some early inscriptions, treat Gilgamesh as semi-divine. The epic says he's 2/3 god and 1/3 human, and his mother is named as Ninsun, explicitly a goddess. The text uses the divine determinative. It's not subtle, so Gilgamesh isn't just a human king. In the world view of the sources, he's a bridge figure, the last kind of ruler, who still has direct divine blood in a world that's becoming fully human. That matters, because it explains why the epic's central crisis isn't just grief, it's confusion. His companion, Enkidu, dies, and Gilgamesh's response isn't only sadness, it's existential shock. He says in effect, "Shall I die too? Am I not like Enkidu?" Most people read that like a poetic lament, but in context, it sounds like genuine disbelief. Because Gilgamesh has divine heritage, because his ancestors, according to the traditions surrounding him, lived longer, because the King List begins with rulers who lasted thousands upon thousands of years, death, for someone like him, shouldn't feel inevitable. And yet Enkidu dies completely, permanently, reduced to dust like any mortal man. And Gilgamesh realizes something is failing. Whatever the old world had, whatever made divine lineage meaningful, doesn't work the same anymore. So he does what a transitional figure would do. He tries to go back, not geographically, cosmologically. He tries to reach the one living human who survived the old world intact, Utnapishtim. And Gilgamesh's journey is described in a way that feels less like a normal heroic quest and more like crossing reality layers. Every stage takes him further from the normal world. He reaches a mountain pass guarded by scorpion beings, creatures described as half human, half divine. They're shocked that anyone mortal would attempt to enter, but they recognize something about him and allow him through. Then he travels through 12 leagues of darkness, complete darkness, an impossible passage no ordinary human has survived. Then he reaches the waters of death, and the boatman warns him, if he touches the water, he will die. Gilgamesh has to cut 120 punting poles because each can only be used once. That detail is so oddly specific it reads like a manual, like the text is describing a dangerous environment with operational rules. This isn't just adventure storytelling. It feels like a map of a boundary zone, an attempt to describe what it takes to cross from the post-flood world into the edges of what came before. And when Gilgamesh finally reaches Utnapishtim, the survivor's reaction is not what you'd expect. Utnapishtim doesn't praise him. He doesn't treat him like a heroic conqueror. He looks at him and asks, "Why are you worn down? Why are your cheeks hollow? Why do you look like someone who has been consumed by worry?" It's like he's seeing the decay in him, like he's seeing his partial divinity slipping. Gilgamesh says he's searching for eternal life because Utnapishtim has it. And Utnapishtim doesn't respond with moral lecture. He responds with the truth that destroys the entire hope. Immortality is no longer available, not because Gilgamesh isn't worthy, not because the gods hate him, but because the mechanism that granted immortality was a one-time dispensation tied to the flood. Utnapishtim himself didn't earn it through righteousness. He was granted it as compensation after surviving a catastrophe. The gods themselves regretted. Then he was exiled, and that exile is the most revealing part. Utnapishtim and his wife are made like the gods, and then they are sent far away to the mouth of the rivers, someplace deliberately removed from human contact. So the epic isn't saying, immortality exists if you're good enough. It's saying, immortality exists and you can't access it anymore. The door is closed. Then Utnapishtim offers Gilgamesh a test. Stay awake for 7 days and 7 nights. Gilgamesh immediately falls asleep. When he wakes up, he insists he only slept for a moment, but Utnapishtim's wife points out the proof: 7 loaves baked, 1 each day, now in stages of decay. On the surface, it's a simple humiliation, but look at what the test represents. In ancient Near Eastern thought, sleep is the little death, a daily surrender of consciousness, its biological limitation, written into the body. Utnapishtim isn't testing Gilgamesh's willpower, he's demonstrating biology. You can't conquer death if you can't even conquer the daily shutdown your body demands. And for a king who believed divine heritage should change the rules, that's the final blow. Gilgamesh isn't denied immortality because he failed morally. He's denied because his body belongs to the new world. He's built for the post-flood reality. He can be extraordinary, powerful, semi-divine, but he cannot return to the old dispensation. And then comes the cruelest detail, because it proves the old world still has artifacts left behind. Utnapishtim tells him about a plant at the bottom of the sea that restores youth, if not immortality. Gilgamesh dives down, retrieves it, and he doesn't even rush to use it. He plans to take it home, test it on an old man, and then use it strategically. That's not fantasy thinking. That's someone treating it like recoverable technology, like a lost tool. But while he bathes, a serpent smells the plant, takes it, eats it, and then sheds its skin renewed before disappearing. And Gilgamesh sits down and weeps, not because he's afraid of death in the abstract, because he just watched proof that restoration was possible, and he lost it. The plant works. The serpent demonstrated it, which makes the loss sharper. It wasn't just hope, it was real in his hands, and now it's gone. And the epic ends with something quiet and brutal. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk. He shows his boatmen the wall's massive fortifications he built, structures that archaeologists can associate with the early city. The story shifts from immortality to legacy. He didn't reopen the old world. He didn't reclaim divine kingship. He didn't bring immortality back into human reach. But he built, he governed, he left something that outlasted him. And that conclusion is radical when you understand the epic's context. It's humanity learning to live with limitation. The old dispensation is closed. The gods have withdrawn. Even the descendants of gods are aging. So what remains is the work. The epic isn't just a myth about a hero's journey. It's a memory of the first time someone realized the boundary is permanent, and if even Gilgamesh can't cross it, then no one can. Which brings us to what happens next in history, because once you accept the boundary as real in the minds of ancient people, you start seeing the post-flood world as a long attempt to replace what was lost. Kings now justify themselves through law, through monuments, through divine authorization mediated by priests, because the authority that once descended from heaven no longer arrives that way, and you can see that shift carved into stone. Hammurabi, stands before Shamash, not as a god. As a man receiving symbols, he must interpret. That's the world after the boundary, and it's where we're going next. If you want a single image that captures what the world looks like after the boundary, after the flood, after the withdrawal, you can't do much better than the Stele of Hammurabi. It's carved around 1750 BC and now sits in the Louvre. At the top, you see Hammurabi standing before the seated god Shamash, receiving the symbols of authority, the rod and ring. It's one of the most famous scenes in ancient art, a king receiving divine legitimacy. But notice what the image actually says. Hammurabi isn't divine. He's unmistakably human. He stands below Shamash. He receives authority rather than embodying it. And the god doesn't speak directly in the scene. We don't see a divine command etched across the top. We see symbols handed over, meaning kingship is mediated, authorized, yes, but not possessed. Divine approval is now something you claim and demonstrate, not something that simply descends and makes you ruler by default. And that shift is even clearer when you read the code below the image. Hammurabi's laws aren't enforced by gods, they're enforced by human courts, human officials, human penalties. The laws are written in conditional form. If a man does this, then this shall be done. A system designed to function without requiring divine intervention at every step. This is what governance looks like once humanity is running the machine itself. Now compare that to the King List's earliest kings. No laws, no justifications, no monuments claiming legitimacy, no elaborate argument for why they rule. They simply are. Post-flood kings have to work. They have to justify. They have to maintain. They have to enforce. It's the difference between inheriting a functioning system and being forced to operate it when the original engineers are gone. You can see that defensiveness in earlier law codes too. Ur-Nammu's code, older than Hammurabi, opens with language that feels like an argument. After An and Enlil granted kingship, at that time Ur-Nammu, son of Ninsun, it's framed as legitimacy. It's, I am king because the gods granted it. That's not how antediluvian kingship is described. Antediluvian kingship requires no defense. It descends, and that's enough. And once you see that pattern, you start to notice something even more unsettling. After the boundary, the systems of civilization continue, but they feel inherited. Temple economies keep running. Administrative frameworks persist. Accounting methods remain stable. The machinery stays in place, but it's now being operated by humans who constantly invoke divine sanction as if trying to keep the system aligned. The earliest urban archives show bureaucratic methods already established: ration distributions, land measurements, standardized weights. Later dynasties don't invent entirely new frameworks. They adjust and preserve. Egypt's administrative divisions, the nomes, were treated as ancient foundational structures. Chinese tradition talks about administrative principles handed down from legendary sage kings. Even when empires change, they portray themselves as restoring an ancient order, not building from scratch. Across cultures, early post-boundary civilization behaves less like invention and more like maintenance. And here's where the flood returns not as a moral story, but as a civilizational hinge. Because flood narratives across cultures consistently do something that doesn't match the popular interpretation. They don't end with restoration. They end with separation. Let's go back to the Mesopotamian flood story in Gilgamesh, because it's the clearest version of this. After the flood, the gods argue. They regret. They react like beings who unleash something and then realize the consequences. Then Enlil grants Utnapishtim immortality and exiles him. So the survivor doesn't become a new ruler. He doesn't teach humanity openly. He doesn't rebuild the world as a divine patriarch. He is removed. A living remnant of the old world is deliberately placed beyond human reach. If the flood were primarily about cleansing and restarting divine governance, you'd expect the gods to re-establish direct rule after the waters recede. But that's not what the story says. It says the opposite. The old connection is cut. Now look at Genesis through that lens. After the flood, God makes a covenant with Noah. Most people read that as reassurance. Don't worry, I won't do that again. But read carefully. It's also a statement of non-intervention. God isn't promising continued direct presence. He's promising limits on catastrophe. Never again will flood waters destroy all flesh. In a sense, never again will the divine act in that same overwhelming, world-resetting way. The rainbow isn't just comfort. It's a boundary marker, a sign that the rules have changed. And this theme repeats in other traditions too. Greek flood stories end with a world reshaped. Yes, but the older divine order is not restored. Titans are gone. Olympians rule from a distance. The closeness of the earlier age is lost. Hindu traditions describe ages, yugas, where divine presence is strongest at the beginning and declines. The flood-like resets don't restore closeness. They move history into a more degraded era. The pattern is consistent. Warning catastrophe, survival withdrawal. Not punishment cleansing, return to paradise. And that shift matters because it reframes what the flood is doing in these texts. It's not just a disaster, it's closure. It's the moment where something that once walked among humans is no longer accessible in the same way. Now, you might ask, is there any physical trace that something like a catastrophic flood happened in the region where these stories begin? And yes, there are flood deposits. At sites like archaeologists have found thick, sterile layers, water-laid clay deposits with no artifacts separating earlier occupation levels from later ones. Leonard Woolley famously thought he'd found evidence of Noah's flood. Similar flood layers appear at Kish and Shuruppak. They're not global. They don't prove a worldwide deluge, but they do confirm something important. Catastrophic flooding is real in Mesopotamian early history. And what's interesting isn't just the flood layer itself, it's what appears after. Because after those early flood horizons, Mesopotamia sees an explosion of urban culture. Large city-states, complex administration, writing, standardized accounting. It looks less like civilization slowly being invented after a flood and more like civilization being rebuilt. That's the feeling you get when you put the archaeological pattern next to the textual pattern. A disaster, followed by rapid reorganization. Survivors carrying knowledge inappropriate for their circumstances. Because that's another recurring detail across flood traditions. Survivors know things. Utnapishtim is given precise construction specifications for the boat ratios, measurements, ceiling instructions. Noah receives detailed architectural dimensions for the ark numbers that imply an understanding of structure and buoyancy. Manu, in Hindu tradition, is warned by a speaking fish with knowledge of what's coming. These aren't stories where a primitive person stumbles into survival. They're stories where survival is engineered, selected, guided, and those selected carry something forward: knowledge, memory, structure. So once you accept that flood narratives are often stories of separation rather than restoration, the boundary takes on a different weight. It becomes the marker between two regimes. Before, direct divine action, extraordinary longevity, kingship descending, civilization appearing already organized. After, indirect divine communication, human governance, law codes, monuments, incremental progress, civilization as maintenance. Now, Modern archaeology does have an external event that lines up with the idea of a major boundary catastrophe, not in 3000 BC, but much earlier. Between about 12,900 and 11,700 years ago, Earth experienced the Younger Dryas, a sharp climate reversal near the end of the last ice age. Greenland ice cores showed temperature drops happening extremely fast within a decade. Sea levels, rainfall patterns, ecosystems all destabilized. Then, around 11,700 years ago, climate suddenly stabilizes, and within a human lifetime, the world becomes predictable enough for agriculture and settlement to flourish. And right after that stabilization, the earliest known monumental architecture appears Göbekli Tepe around 9,500 BC. So the question becomes, why did civilization appear so suddenly after climate stabilized? If humans had the capacity to build monuments in 9,500 BC, why do we see so little comparable construction during the preceding tens of thousands of years of anatomically modern human existence? One answer is, we simply haven't found it. Another answer is, if something existed before, a catastrophic climatic period could have erased coastal settlements and fragile structures, and ancient texts across cultures keep insisting that there was an earlier world and it ended in catastrophe. Which brings us back to the big question. If the flood boundary marks the end of the old world, then who carried memory of that world into the new one? And what did they remember? Because in the Epic of Gilgamesh, that memory lives in one place, the survivor beyond the boundary, Utnapishtim. And Gilgamesh's entire quest is built on one truth. He knows something existed before him, and he knows it's gone. So if even a semi-divine king couldn't reclaim it, what did humanity inherit instead? And why does post-boundary civilization feel less like discovery and more like people desperately trying to keep something running? If you zoom out far enough, the flood boundary stops looking like a single story and starts looking like a shared template, one that ancient cultures used to structure reality itself. Not once there was a flood, but there was a before, and then something happened, and now we live in the after. And what's haunting is that the after doesn't feel like a fresh start. It feels like inheritance, like being handed a complicated machine with no manual and realizing the people who built it are gone. That theme, inheritance without full understanding, shows up everywhere once you start looking for it. Post-flood kings don't describe themselves as inventors of order. They describe themselves as restorers. They build temples, as in ancient times. They claim to revive old rituals. They declare they are returning the world to rightful balance. They speak as custodians of something older than them. Even when they conquer, even when they innovate, the language is backwards facing, and you see it in religious practice too. Later, priesthoods obsess over correctness, correct words, correct gestures, correct timing, correct offerings, correct alignment. It's as if precision is the only remaining way to touch something that used to be near enough to answer directly. That's why later ritual gets so complex. Not because gods demand complexity, because humans fear absence. Now, this isn't just poetic interpretation. We can watch it happen in the structure of Mesopotamian religion. Early on, temple architecture looks like habitation, a place for the deity to be. Later on, it looks like performance, a place for priests to do what must be done to invoke presence. Early texts show direct speech. Later texts show interpretation. And then you find technical manuals like the Liver Omen texts, where divine will has become something you compute, not hear, compute. And that tells you something about the post-boundary world. It's a world built around trying to recover a lost clarity, which leads to the most uncomfortable part of all of this. what exactly was lost, because the texts preserve multiple kinds of loss at once. Longevity collapses. Divine kingship becomes claimed rather than inherent. Divine communication becomes mediated. Knowledge appears early as if inherited and then stabilizes instead of accelerating. The pattern doesn't look like humanity rising. It looks like humanity adapting to absence. And that raises three possible explanations, three ways to read the evidence. None of them are clean. None of them are comfortable. But all three account for the same strange features. Explanation 1. It's all myth, symbolic representation. The gods are metaphors for early social order. Their departure represents humanity psychologically maturing from dependence to autonomy. The flood is a narrative device used to separate legendary time from historical time. That interpretation can explain why cultures talk about gods walking among humans. It can explain why early kings appear larger than life, but it struggles with the specificity. Myths tend to simplify. These records complicate. The Sumerian numbers are systematic. The Genesis ages decline in a structured curve. Egyptian divine dynasties are inserted into administrative chronology, not poetic myth. Multiple traditions, independent traditions, use the same boundary structure. Symbolism alone has trouble explaining why the patterns line up. Explanation 2. The texts preserve memory of a lost human civilization. An advanced society existed before a catastrophic climate period, possibly something like the Younger Dryas disruption, and was largely destroyed. Survivors carried fragments of knowledge forward into later cultures. This explanation fits certain things well. It explains why sophisticated systems appear suddenly. Writing that's already bureaucratic, base 60 math that's already optimized, early urban planning that looks mature. It also makes sense of flood myths as cultural memory of catastrophe, but it carries a heavy cost. It means rewriting the standard archaeological timeline. It requires believing an entire advanced civilization vanished so completely that we've found almost no direct physical remains, no cities, no clear industrial traces, no unambiguous artifacts. Not impossible, but difficult. It turns history into a search for a missing world. Explanation 3. The texts are describing what they insist on describing. Non-human or semi-divine beings ruled early Earth, established foundational systems, and withdrew after a catastrophic boundary event. This explanation fits the internal logic of the sources best. It matches kingship descended from heaven. It matches the way early texts describe gods as present participants in administration. It matches the way divine lineage and divine kingship fade rather than disappear instantly. It matches why later civilizations keep trying to interpret the gods, because they remember a time when the gods spoke clearly. But the cost of this explanation is obvious. It violates modern assumptions about what's historically possible. It pushes you into territory most historians won't go near, not because it's disproven, but because it breaks the framework. So here's what matters. Regardless of which explanation you favor, the records consistently describe absence, a presence that once was and no longer is, an authority that once functioned directly and now functions only through mediation, a biological condition, extreme longevity that collapses, a kind of kingship that descends and then never descends again. That absence is the shared core, and it's not framed as humanity gaining something. It's framed as humanity losing something. That's the part that doesn't match the modern story. Modern history is progress, from primitive to advanced. But the ancient record is often reversal, from direct to indirect, from extraordinary to ordinary, from near to distant, from the gods among us to the gods above us. Now, once you notice this, the flood stops being a myth about punishment. It becomes a historical boundary marker that ancient cultures used as their own line between eras. And that boundary doesn't just change lifespans and kingship, it changes the entire human relationship with the divine. Because after the boundary, everything becomes mediated. Kings stand before gods in art, receiving symbols. Priests interpret signs. Rituals become elaborate technologies for attempting contact. Law becomes a human-run system justified by divine sanction, not enforced by divine presence. And that mediated world produces a new kind of human story, one where meaning isn't delivered but constructed. That's why the Epic of Gilgamesh lands where it does. Gilgamesh returns to his walls. He accepts that immortality is closed. He builds anyway. That's the message of the post-boundary world. If the old order is gone, you still build. And you can see that message hardening into civilization over time. After the initial burst of sophisticated systems, progress slows to a human pace. Bronze metallurgy improves gradually. Writing evolves incrementally. Architecture develops through trial and error. That's normal human development, which suggests that the early completeness wasn't the result of slow invention. It was the starting package. And once the starting package is in place, history becomes the story of humans learning to operate it. That's why ancient kings are obsessed with legitimacy. That's why temples become machines of ritual. That's why scribes copy old lists and argue over contradictions. They're not inventing meaning. They're trying to preserve continuity with a world that feels like it had a different kind of authority. And at this point, you might be thinking, okay, but why does this matter beyond ancient curiosity? Because if the ancient record is even partly right, then what we call history is not the story of becoming civilized. It's the story of what happened after the gods, after the boundary, after the withdrawal, which is why the King List's floodline hits so hard. Then the flood swept over, and then only then does human history begin in the way we recognize it. So the real question isn't, did the flood happen exactly as described? The real question is, why do the oldest records insist that our normal world begins only after something ended? And if something ended, what exactly was it? Because the next step is to look at the evidence that ancient people themselves treated that boundary as real, not just in myth, but in scholarship. Babylonian scribes copied the King List for centuries, comparing versions, trying to reconcile numbers. Egyptian priests preserved divine dynasties as chronology. Biblical authors preserved the lifespan decline as generational history. These aren't casual stories. They are attempts to keep a timeline intact. And that's why, when you stand back, the pattern becomes hard to ignore. Multiple civilizations remembered the same kind of break. They didn't remember gradual progress. They remembered loss. And the question modern scholarship avoids, because it's the one with no comfortable answer, is the one the ancient record keeps pointing to. What exactly was the world like before the gods left? At this point, it's tempting to want a big, clean conclusion. A single answer that resolves everything. But the evidence doesn't really allow that, at least not honestly. What it does allow is something else. A sharper view of what the ancient sources are actually doing, and why their before and after boundary is so consistent across cultures. Because whether you read the gods as literal beings, as symbols, or as memory of an older civilization, the texts keep insisting on the same structure. There was an earlier regime of reality, then a catastrophe, then a new regime. And the new regime is recognizably human. That's what the King List is marking. Not just a flood, a shift in the operating system. So let's go back to the Sumerian phrase itself. The King List doesn't say, then the world was destroyed. It says, then the flood swept over, and then it moves on. No dramatic reflection. No moral sermon. It just transitions into a different kind of time. And that bluntness is what makes it feel less like storytelling and more like record keeping. It reads like, yes, the old era ended. Now here's the new one. And then it does something that modern readers often miss. It treats the post-flood kings as less stable. Not less important, less stable. The reign lengths shrink, yes, but so does the sense of inevitability. Dynasties become more contested. Legitimacy becomes something that must be asserted, fought over, performed. That aligns with what we see in actual history. The earliest city-states have shifting dominance, rival claims, military conflict, propaganda. In other words, human politics. But the pre-flood section doesn't have that feel. It has passive authority. Kings simply reign. Cities simply hold kingship. The system is almost mechanical, and that contrast is one of the strongest internal signals that the text is describing two different modes, not one continuous political landscape. Now, here's another layer that matters. Later scribes weren't treating the pre-flood section like a fairy tale. They were trying to reconcile it. The dynastic chronicle copies, the variant king lists, the scholarly attempts to compare versions, those are signs of genuine concern. If it were clearly myth time, nobody would care about the exact reign totals. Nobody would argue over whether there were 8 rulers or 10, but they did, because they were trying to preserve a chronology they believed mattered, even if it didn't fully make sense. That's the human signature of inherited tradition. You preserve what you don't understand because you assume it's important. Now, put that into the broader ancient world. Why does Egypt preserve pre-dynastic divine rulers as part of its king list tradition? Why does Genesis preserve the lifespan collapse rather than just presenting a simplified ancient people lived long back then statement? Why do flood traditions repeatedly end with survivors being separated from the old world? Because these aren't just entertaining myths. They are frameworks for explaining why the world feels the way it does. And in all of them, the present world is portrayed as less than what came before. That's what makes it so strange. Ancient cultures usually glorify origins. They celebrate golden ages, yes, but they usually use them to justify present authority. Here, though, the golden age is not just better, it's different. Different biology, different governance, different access to divine communication, different baseline reality. And that's why the flood boundary isn't just a story. It's an explanation for why humans must now govern themselves through law, through institutions, through mediation, because direct governance is gone. Now, if you're looking for how ancient people process that loss emotionally, the Epic of Gilgamesh is the clearest window. Gilgamesh's grief over Enkidu is grief over mortality, yes, but it's also grief over closure, over the realization that the pre-flood regime, where longevity and divine proximity were possible, is not coming back. And the epic's ending is basically a blueprint for what civilization becomes after the boundary. You build anyway. You create permanence through work, not through immortality. You accept that you can't return, and you adapt. Now, that adaptation is visible in the historical record too. Take kingship. Post-flood rulers increasingly anchor legitimacy in 3 things: divine sanction, but mediated, chosen by the gods, beloved of Enlil, appointed by Shamash, lineage descent from earlier kings, often with claims of divine ancestry, far enough back to feel credible but not testable, visible achievements, walls, temples, canals, victories, inscriptions. That's not how antediluvian kingship is presented. Antediluvian kingship requires no performance. Post-flood kingship is performance. And over time, the performance gets more elaborate because the gap between claim and reality widens. Early on, you still see rulers being labeled divine in some chronicles. Then that fades. Then you see kings calling themselves like a god. Then later, you see kings focusing on being appointed rather than being divine. That's a slow retreat. Now take divine communication, early texts, direct dialogue, later texts, omens, dream interpretation, astrology, exispacy manuals, ritual technologies. That's also a slow retreat, not a sudden silence, but a degradation that produces whole professions devoted to decoding. And even in the flood narratives, the retreat is staged. Utnapishtim is made immortal, then removed. The bridge is severed. The old world is not destroyed completely, it's made inaccessible. Now, one of the strongest reasons this all matters is that it forces you to reconsider what civilization might mean in the ancient worldview. Modern narratives say, civilization is invented. Ancient narratives often say, civilization is received. Sumerian texts speak about the me, the fundamental ordinances being distributed, about kingship being brought down, about temples being established in ways that sound like placement, not construction. Egyptian tradition speaks of Ma'at as cosmic order established in the first time and maintained afterward. Biblical tradition speaks of a world where sons of God interact with humans in early generations, then vanish after the flood boundary, leaving a more purely human world. Different traditions, same structure. Early reality has direct contact, later reality has distance, which is why the flood boundary keeps showing up as the hinge. And here's the final piece of tension that's worth sitting with. If the early age was myth, why do these records describe it as loss? If it's invention, why do they mourn it? If it's propaganda, why would it undermine human kings by implying they are weaker replacements? A propaganda narrative would usually do the opposite. We are the peak, we are the culmination. But the ancient record keeps saying, we are after the gods, after the long lives, after the direct presence, after the descending kingship. And that's why the Sumerian King List, the Turin Canon, and Genesis don't just feel like stories. They feel like fragments of a worldview trying to explain why humans are now alone at the controls. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with something that isn't a neat conclusion, but is still meaningful. The oldest records don't present human history as a beginning. They present it as a continuation after interruption, a world where civilization exists, but the original source is no longer directly involved. And the flood, whether literal, regional, symbolic, or memory of a larger catastrophe, functions as the marker of that transition, which means the question the ancient record pushes toward is not, did gods exist? It's this: what exactly changed at the boundary that made the world start behaving like our world? Because if you accept the boundary as a real conceptual line, then the story of civilization becomes less about invention and more about adaptation. Humans learning to govern without direct oversight. Humans learning to enforce law without divine intervention. Humans learning to build permanence without immortality. Humans learning to interpret silence. And that is a very different way to see history. A history not of climbing upward, but of keeping something alive after those who maintained it withdrew. So when you read that single sentence, then the flood swept over, it stops feeling like mythology. It starts feeling like a timestamp, a line drawn by scribes who believed they were marking the moment the world changed categories. And if they were right even partly, then everything we call history is simply what happened after the gods. If there's one thing these ancient records do better than modern summaries, it's this: they refuse to let the boundary fade into the background. They keep circling it, copying it, preserving it, building their timelines around it, even when they don't understand it, even when the numbers don't match perfectly, Even when the texts contradict each other in the details, they still agree on the shape: a before, a flood, an after, and in a way, that persistence is itself evidence, not evidence that the stories are literally true in every detail, but evidence that ancient people treated the boundary as meaningful enough to anchor everything else to it. Because if it was just a myth, you'd expect it to be flexible. You'd expect it to be optional. Instead, it's structural. In Mesopotamia, you can see that in the way scribes keep producing new King List copies. They compare reign lengths, they note discrepancies, they attempt reconciliations. Some traditions preserve 8 antediluvian rulers, others 10, but almost none remove the antediluvian section entirely. They might argue over the numbers, but not over the existence of the break. In Egypt, even when the Turin canon is fragmented, the tradition remains stubborn. Divine and semi-divine dynasties precede human kings, and later priestly historiography keeps that framework alive for centuries. In the biblical tradition, the genealogies aren't written like loose mythic storytelling, they're written like record-keeping. Names, lifespans, generations, a systematic decline. Even if you treat it as theological literature, it still behaves like preserved chronology, which is why the simplest thing you can say without forcing a single conclusion is this. Ancient cultures remembered a time that wasn't like now, and they remembered a transition into now. And they didn't celebrate that transition as progress. They marked it like loss. That's the emotional fingerprint that keeps showing up. Now, you could argue that this loss is psychological humans projecting nostalgia for a golden age. That's valid as a theory. But again, it bumps into the specificity problem. Nostalgia doesn't usually produce consistent mathematical structures, cross-cultural boundary placement, and long-term scribal preservation of awkward details. Nostalgia tends to simplify into "back then was better." These texts don't just say better, they say different, and they describe how. Different longevity, different kingship mechanics, different divine communication, different baseline reality. And whether you interpret gods as literal beings or as metaphors for something else, the functional change is still being recorded. So what is that change? In the cleanest terms, it's a transition from direct authority to mediated authority. Before the boundary, authority descends and simply is. After the boundary, authority has to be justified, interpreted, performed, and maintained. That's true in kingship. It's true in religion. It's true in law. It's even true in knowledge systems, where early sophistication feels inherited and later progress feels human and incremental. And that makes the flood boundary feel less like a mythic story device and more like a cultural memory of discontinuity. Now, if you step back and look at human history in that light, you start seeing why later civilizations are so obsessed with restoration. This isn't just Mesopotamia. In Egypt, kings constantly talk about restoring marked cosmic order as if order is something that can slip away. In China, the mandate of heaven is framed as delegated authority that can be lost if the ruler fails to maintain harmony. In later Near Eastern traditions, kings often portray themselves not as inventors, but as renewers of ancient ways. That theme of maintenance, of keeping the world aligned, only makes sense if there's an underlying sense that alignment is inherited, not created. It's like the post-boundary world comes with a sense of responsibility. We have to keep this going. And that idea is exactly what the Sumerian King List implies when it transitions into recognizably human reigns. The kings after the flood aren't given absurd durations. They get shrinking reign lengths that move toward normal human time, like the world is stabilizing into a new mode. If you read it metaphorically, it's a story about civilization coming down to earth. If you read it literally, it's a story about biology changing. If you read it as cultural memory, it's a story about a break in continuity, and the reason it matters is because every reading still points to the same core truth. The ancient record insists we live in the aftermath of something. Now, there's another point in the script that's worth spotlighting, because it's easy to miss, but it changes how you interpret divine withdrawal. When later religions try to preserve old rituals, they often preserve language they no longer fully understand. Babylonian priests perform liturgies in archaic Sumerian. Egyptian priests preserve formulas whose roots go back into Old Kingdom or earlier tradition. In many religious systems, the oldest words become sacred precisely because they're old, because they're believed to carry original power. That's a human response to absence. When you don't have direct contact, you cling to the original forms. You treat the preserved words like keys, and that can create the illusion of continuity even when the lived reality has shifted. So post-boundary religion becomes, in a sense, a technology of remembrance, a way of maintaining contact with memory. And that's where the flood narratives, strangely, feel less like moral lectures and more like origin documents for the new regime. They explain why the old world is gone and why it cannot be reached. The survivor is exiled. The covenant limits intervention. The gods retreat, and the message is the same: continue without us. Now, if you follow that thread back into the Epic of Gilgamesh one more time, you can see it shaping the first truly human, philosophical conclusion in recorded literature. Gilgamesh goes to the boundary. He reaches the remnant. He is told no. He is shown his biology. He loses the restorative plant, and then he returns to work. That is, in a way, the founding psychology of post-boundary humanity. You cannot recover the old dispensation, so you build within the new one. And if that's the ancient worldview, if that's what these texts are preserving, then the question isn't only about what happened back then. It becomes a question about what we think history is. Because in the modern imagination, history is a climb. But in the ancient record, history is stewardship. We didn't create civilization from nothing. We inherited it, then learned slowly, painfully to operate it ourselves. That doesn't prove gods walked among humans. It doesn't prove there were kings ruling for 30,000 years. But it does prove something about how the earliest scribal cultures understood themselves. They believed they were living after a fall, after a closure, after a time when the world had a different relationship to authority, and that belief shaped everything: their institutions, their ritual technology, their law codes, their obsession with legitimacy, their constant reference to ancient times. So what do we do with that? If you're a mainstream historian, you say, these are myths encoding social change. If you're a catastrophist, you say, these are memories of a destroyed civilization. If you take the texts at face value, you say, these are records of non-human governance withdrawing. But no matter which you choose, one thing remains stubbornly consistent. The boundary is real in the sources. The absence is real in the sources. And the transition is the foundation of what they consider human history. So maybe the best way to end this isn't to tell you which interpretation is right. It's to return to the single line that started everything, because the line itself still does what it did 4,000 years ago. It divides worlds. Then the flood swept over, and what follows is what we call history, which brings us to the final question, the one that sits underneath all of this and doesn't go away. If human history begins when the gods stop ruling, what does that say about everything we've built since? Are we progressing, or are we adapting? And if we're adapting, to what kind of absence? When you strip everything down, every clay prism, every broken tablet, every king list, every genealogy, every flood story, you're left with something surprisingly simple. Not a proof, not a final answer, a pattern of memory. A pattern of discontinuity, a pattern of people looking backward, not because they were nostalgic, but because they believed the world used to operate under different rules. That's what the Sumerian King List is doing when it calmly lists rulers who reign for tens of thousands of years, then drops a single sentence like a guillotine. Then the flood swept over, and then it continues, as if we've crossed into a different category of time. And it's what Egyptian tradition is doing when it preserves divine and semi-divine dynasties in its own chronological framework, then transitions into human kings with normal reigns. And it's what Genesis is doing when it preserves a generational decline in lifespan, too systematic to feel like a random mythic flourish, tracking a world that cools down biologically after a catastrophic boundary. Different cultures, different languages, different worlds, same shape, before. Extraordinary longevity, direct divine involvement, kingship framed as descending, reality operating at a mythic intensity. After, human-scale lifespans, mediated divine communication, kingship justified through law and lineage, civilization maintained through institutions. And that, more than any single detail, is the core mystery. Because if these were just invented legends, you'd expect the stories to focus on triumph. You'd expect them to celebrate progress, humanity rising, conquering nature, earning knowledge, becoming great. But the ancient record often feels like the opposite. It feels like humanity waking up in a world where the old support system is gone, and everything after that is what we call history. Now, modern scholarship has its frameworks, and those frameworks exist for a reason. You can't take every ancient claim at face value. Texts can be symbolic, political, theological, and shaped by centuries of copying. But what you also can't do, at least not honestly, is pretend these patterns aren't there. Because even if you interpret the gods metaphorically, you still have to explain why the metaphor is the same across independent traditions. Even if you interpret the flood as regional catastrophe memory, you still have to explain why it functions as a boundary marker everywhere it appears. Even if you interpret pre-flood rains as symbolic cycles, you still have to explain why the symbolism stops at the same boundary where other cultures mark collapse. So, instead of forcing one conclusion, the evidence offers you a set of possibilities, and each one asks something from you. If it's myth, then these are myths with unusual precision and cross-cultural structural similarity, preserved by scribes who treated them as chronology. If it's memory of catastrophe, then human history includes a discontinuity deeper than our standard models comfortably allow, with knowledge carried forward from a world we haven't fully mapped. If it's literal, then the oldest records aren't describing humanity inventing civilization at all. They're describing humanity inheriting it from beings who withdrew. 3 readings, different implications, but the same central fact. The ancient world believed something ended, and what we call civilization is what continued afterward. That's why Gilgamesh matters so much, because he stands right at the edge of that transition, historical enough to touch, mythic enough to bridge. And his story isn't, I fear death. It's, I know immortality existed, and I can't reach it anymore. He travels to the boundary. He reaches the last survivor. He is told no. He fails the biological test. He loses the restorative plant. Then he returns to the city and shows the walls. He builds anyway. That's not just a literary ending. It's a world view, a statement that the old world is closed, and meaning now has to be made through work, through structure, through memory, turned into institutions. And if you look at the post-boundary world, Mesopotamian law codes, Egyptian royal ideology, priestly divination systems, monumental building projects, that's exactly what you see. Humans trying to keep a system going, kings justifying their authority instead of embodying it, priests interpreting signs instead of hearing direct commands, ritual becoming technology, civilization becoming maintenance. So what does all of this really leave you with? A different way to frame history, not as a straight line of progress from primitive to advanced, but as a long adaptation to absence, a world where the earliest records insist that something was once closer, authority, presence, longevity, knowledge, and then it wasn't. And maybe that's the simplest reason these documents still matter, because they challenge the story we tell ourselves. We like the idea that we climbed up from nothing, that we invented everything, that we built civilization from scratch. But the oldest records don't say that. They say civilization was given, then interrupted, then carried forward by humans who no longer had direct access to the source. Whether that source was gods, a lost civilization, or something else entirely, what matters is that the texts insist it was there, and they insist it's gone. The Sumerian King List still sits in a museum. The Turin Canon still preserves its broken transition. Genesis still holds its decline curve. The flood boundary still divides their chronologies, and the question is still sitting there, untouched, because it makes modern people uncomfortable. If everything we call history begins after a withdrawal, what exactly withdrew? And if it withdrew, why did every civilization spend thousands of years building temples, writing rituals, forming priesthoods, and inventing systems to reach it again? Maybe the most unsettling possibility isn't that ancient gods were real. Maybe it's that the oldest cultures on Earth saw themselves as living in the aftermath of something greater than them, and built their entire world around the fact that it was no longer here. So the next time you hear flood myth, remember what the texts themselves actually do. They don't treat the flood as a bedtime story. They treat it as the line where the world changed categories. Then the flood swept over, and everything after that is us